Johann Hari recently wrote a widely read piece for a Huffington Post headlined, "The likely cause of addiction has been discovered, and it's not what you think." Johann, welcome to Democracy Now! What is it, then?
Well, it's fascinating. If you had said to me 4 years ago, when I started on the really long journey through 9 countries to write this book, what causes, say, heroin addiction, I would have looked at you like you were a little bit simple-minded, and I would have said, well, heroin causes heroin addiction. We've been told a story for 100 years that is so deep in our culture that we just take it for granted. We basically think, if you, me, and I guess there's about 20 people in this office, if we all took heroin for 20 days, by day 21, because there are chemical hooks in heroin, our bodies would physically need the heroin and we would be heroin addicts. That's what we think heroin addiction is. The first thing that, and I had a really personal reason to want to look into this, we had a lot of addiction in my family. One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And one of the first things, when I was looking at what really causes addiction, that alerted me that that story there's something wrong with that story. So just explain to me, if one of us steps out here today and we get hit by a car, right, God forbid, and we break our hip, we'll be taken to hospital. There's a very good chance we'll be given a lot of diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin. It's much better heroin than you'll score on the streets because it's 100% pure as opposed to, massively contaminated. You'll be given it for quite a long period of time. That is happening in every hospital in the United States, all over the developed world. People are being given lots of heroin for long periods of time. You will have noticed something odd about that. Your grandmother was not turned into a junkie by her hip operation. If what we thought about addiction was right, those people should be leaving hospital as addicts. In fact, they're not. When I learned that, I didn't really know what to do with it until I went and met an incredible man called Bruce Alexander, who's a professor in Vancouver. He explained to me the old theory of addiction comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They were actually featured in a famous anti-drugs ad from the 80s in America. Very simple experiment. Your viewers can do it at home if they're feeling a little bit sadistic. You get a rat and you put it in a cage, and it's got 2 water bottles. One is just water, and one is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself. And so it was concluded, there you go, that's addiction. But in the 70s, Bruce comes along and says, well, hang on a minute. We're putting the rat in an empty cage. It's got nothing to do except drink the drugged water. Let's do this differently. So Bruce built Rat Park. Rat Park is like heaven for rats. They've got loads of cheese. I don't think it's cheese. It's some very nice food that rats like. Loads of coloured balls, loads of friends. They can have loads of sex. Anything a rat can want, it's got in Rat Park. And they've got both the water bottles. They've got the normal water and the drugged water. But here's the fascinating thing. They obviously tried both the water bottles because they don't know what's in them. They don't like the drugged water. The rats in Rat Park use very little of it, they never overdose, and they never use in a way that looks like addiction or compulsion, which is fascinating. There's a really interesting human example. There's loads of human examples, but I'll give you a specific one in a minute. But what Bruce says is this shows that both the right-wing theory of addiction and the left-wing theories are wrong. The right-wing theory is, you're a hedonist, you party too hard, that you indulge yourself. It's a moral flaw. The left-wing theory is your brain gets hijacked, you get taken over. What Bruce says is, it's not your morality, it's not your brain, it's your cage. Addiction is an adaptation to your environment. Really, and there's massive implications of that, but there's a really interesting human example that was actually going on at the same time as the Rat Park experiment. It's called the Vietnam War. 20% of American troops in Vietnam were using heroin a lot. And if you look at the news reports from the time, there's a real panic because they believed the old theory of addiction. They believed that if these troops were going to come home and you were going to suddenly have enormous numbers of addicts on the streets of the United States. What happened? All the evidence is the vast majority come home and just stop. Because if you're taken out of a hellish pestilential jungle where you don't want to be and you could be killed at any moment, and you go back to your nice life in Wichita, Kansas, with your friends and your family and the purpose in life, it's the equivalent of being taken from the first cage to the second cage. You go back to your connections. What this shows us is, I think there's huge implications for the war on drugs, and that obviously the war on drugs is built on the idea that chemicals cause addiction and we need to physically eradicate the chemicals from the United States now. I don't think that's physically possible. We can't even keep them out of prisons and we've got a walled perimeter. But let's grant the philosophical premise behind that, right? If, in fact, the chemicals are not the primary driver of the addiction, if, in fact, huge numbers, in fact, the vast majority of people who use those chemicals don't become addicted, if, in fact, the driver is isolation, pain and distress, then a policy that's based on inflicting more isolation, pain and distress on addicts is obviously a bad idea. That's what I saw in Arizona. I went out with a female chain gang that are forced to wear T-shirts saying I was a drug addict and, made to dig graves and collect trash. And, the idea that imposing more suffering on addicts will make them better if suffering is the cause is crazy. I actually think there's real implications for the politics that Democracy Now! Covers so well and that we believe in so much. We have created a society where huge numbers of our fellow citizens can't bear to be present in their lives and have to medicate themselves to get through the day with these drugs. There's nothing, a hyper-capitalist, hyper-individualist society makes people feel like the rats in that first cage, that they're cut off from source of meaning. There's nothing, as Bruce explains, there's nothing in human evolution that prepares us for being as isolated as the ideal citizen of a hyper-capitalist, hyper-consumerist country like yours and mine.
Well, in your book, you delve into the origins of our modern drug war and come up with some surprising information that initially it was actually targeting key figures, African-American figures in the musical world. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, not far from where we are now, in 1939, Billie Holiday stands on stage in a hotel and she sings the song Strange Fruit, which obviously your viewers will know is an anti-lynching song. Her goddaughter Lorraine Feather said to me, you've got to understand how shocking this was, right? Billie Holiday wasn't allowed to walk through the front door of that hotel. She had to go through the service elevator. To have an African-American woman standing up at a time when most pop songs were like Twee, P.S. I Love You, that kind of thing, singing against lynching was in front of a white audience was regarded as really shocking. And that night, according to her biographer, Julia Blackburn, she's told by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, stop singing this song. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics was run by a man called Harry Anslinger, who I think is the most influential person who no one's ever heard of. Harry Anslinger takes over the Department of Prohibition just as alcohol prohibition is ending, and he wants to find a new purpose for it. He's got this huge bureaucracy he wants to run, and he's really driven by two passions: an intense hatred of African Americans. I mean, this is a guy who was regarded as a crazy racist by the crazy racists in the 1930s. He used the N-word in official police reports so often that his senator said he should have to resign, and a really strong hatred of addicts. And Billie Holiday to him was like the symbol of everything that was going wrong in America. And so he gives her this order. She refuses. She basically says, screw you, I'm an American citizen, I'll say what I want. She had grown up in segregated Baltimore and she had promised herself she would never bow her head to any white man. And that's when Harry Anslinger begins the process of stalking her and eventually, I think, playing a role in her death, as was explained to me by her friends and by all the archival research. The first person he sends to stalk her is an agent called Jimmy Fletcher. Harry Anslinger hated employing African Americans, but you couldn't really send a white guy into Harlem to stalk Billie Holiday. It'd be kind of obvious. So Jimmy Fletcher follows her around for 2 years, and she was so amazing he fell in love with her. And he felt ashamed his whole life for what he did. He busts her, she's sent to prison. The trial, she said, the trial was called the United States versus Billie Holiday, and that's how it felt. And when she gets out, exactly what happens to addicts all over the United States today happens. What's happened to those women I met in Arizona. She can't get a job. You needed a license to be able to perform anywhere where alcohol was sold, and they wouldn't give her the license. So, her friend Yolanda Bavan said to me, what's the cruelest thing you can do to a person? It's to take away the thing they love. She sinks back into addiction when she's in her early 40s. She collapses here in New York City. She's taken to hospital, and she's convinced the narcotics agents aren't finished with her. And she was right. She says to one of her friends, they're going to kill me in there. Don't let them. They're going to kill me. She was right. In a hospital bed, she's diagnosed with liver cancer. I spoke to the only surviving person who was still in that room, who'd been in that room. She's handcuffed to the bed. And they take away her record player and her candies. They don't let her friends in to see her. One of her friends manages to insist to the doctors they give her methadone because she'd gone into withdrawal. She starts to recover a little bit. 10 days later, they cut off the methadone. She dies. Her friend Annie Ross, there are lots of things that, I think there's lots of things in that dynamic that tell us a lot about the drug war, that it's founded in a race panic. At the same time that Harry Anslinger finds out that Billie Holiday is a heroin user, he finds out that Judy Garland was a heroin user. He advises her to take slightly longer vacations and tells her she's going to be fine. Spot the difference. But the most amazing thing to me about the Billie Holiday story that really helped me to think about the addicts in my life is she never stopped singing that song. She always found somewhere to sing it. She went wherever they would have her, and she sang her song about lynching no matter how much they tried to intimidate her. And to me, that's really inspiring, not just for resisting the racism of the drug war, but actually for realising that addicts can be heroes. All over the world while we're talking, people are listening to Billie Holiday, and they are feeling stronger. And that is an incredible achievement. And the people resisting the drug war who I met all over the world, from a transsexual crack dealer in Brownsville, Brooklyn, to, a scientist who was feeding hallucinogens to mongooses to see what would happen, to the only country that's ever decriminalised all drugs, there is heroism and resistance to this war all over the world.